Greetings, hello, welcome to session 4 of the Game Theory series. So in this session we are mostly going to be talking about strategy. So that is to say about the different varieties of strategy that exist within game theory and how those strategies manifest and interact with different principles that we try to use as strategies, and how some of those principles succeed and fail. Such as, for example, we'll talk about the golden rule, as well as the categorical imperative posed by Immanuel Kant, and then we will move into how those principles and strategies interact with some of the games that we've already discussed. So, for example, how do principles and strategies relate to the prisoner's dilemma, to the dollar auction, to the Hofstadter offer, and we will move into, lastly, a game, a very fun game. I'm sure you've heard of the game Chicken. However, the chicken that was found in this chapter was not the chicken that I was initially familiar with, although this makes sense, but it's a little bit more disastrous. So with that being said, let's break right into it. Alright, so in game theory, there are essentially, so far to my knowledge, or to my knowledge thus far, there are 4 specific strategies. And the first strategy is something called a pure strategy. So a pure strategy is a strategy in which actions are dictated by a principle such that in identical situations, following the principle leads to the same results. So we will get into that. The next strategy is a random strategy. So a random strategy is exactly what it sounds like. It's really no strategy whatsoever. It's just acting completely at random. The next strategy is a mixed strategy, and this is what we will come to find through our discourse today is the most useful, beneficial, or successful strategy. And this strategy essentially is about probability. It's not about necessarily having one specific principle to guide your behavior, or maybe it is rather. It's about probability, but in any given situation, assessing the probability of the different options that you have to act, and acting on the basis of what seems most probable to lead to the ends to which you're trying to get to. And the final strategy is a optimal mixed strategy. So an optimal mixed strategy is essentially a strategy which leads to the most optimal result for the totality of the players within the game. So it's a sort of non-selfish strategy. That's a strategy which seeks to benefit everyone at large. Alright, so with that laid out and being said, let's move into some applications and generations of principles. So in session 3.5, I touched on my solution to the prisoner's dilemma, which was based both on considering the collective interests, as well as considering your own self-interest. So my solution was more or less bound to both of those dimensions. It wasn't just completely singularly reasoned. And so that sort of brings us into these notions of competition and cooperation, which sort of underlines most of game theory, really, the whole thing, is cooperation versus competition. So do I act only in terms of my self-interest? What are the advantages and disadvantages of acting that way? Or should I act in favor of cooperation, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of acting that way? So the principles of acting for yourself are more or less pretty obvious. It's just self-interest. But the dimension of acting considering the collective is a little bit more complicated, or considering others. It's a cooperative principle, right? So when we think of cooperative principles, we then move into, for example, the golden rule, the infamous Bible. I believe its origin is biblical, but it probably occurred before that. I think it's an intuitively obvious principle, which is namely, you should do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Which is interesting but problematic. So one example of the problematic nature of that principle was phrased by Bernard Shaw, I believe his name is, where he says, well, you shouldn't do unto others as you'd have done unto yourself, for the precise reason that you might have different tastes and preferences, and what you might like done unto you might not be what someone else would like done unto them. So not a fully justified, universally applicable principle. So one attempt at a resolution to that principle is, well, you could say it's an attempt at a resolution or just a reframing even of that principle, was posed by Immanuel Kant, which was I believe he was German, he might have been Austrian, but I think he was German philosopher. And his principle was something called the categorical imperative. So I'm gonna have to read the categorical imperative because this old spoken English is, never my thing, as you might remember from session 1. So the categorical imperative states that act as though the maxims according to which you live should by your will become universal natural law. So in other words, to put it plainly, what this means is that categorical means that in any given situation, from a principle, X behavior should follow. And the dimension of maxim is a sort of ethical, personal rule of conduct. So what the categorical imperative is really saying is it's saying that in any given situation, for your actions, however you act should follow from a principle that can be universifiable, or that it can be made into a universal principle, which could be natural law in some sense. Which is to say, an example of that would come in the form of, for example, the Bible. So one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not kill. So that is a universal maxim, or a sort of natural law in the sense that Kant is referring to it in. So it means that in any given situation, don't kill anyone. However, the catch to this, or the sort of clarification of this, which kind of is a savior from the problems of from the golden rule, is that the addendum to this principle is that it's justified so long as it does not lead in any given situation to a logical contradiction or to a problem. So an example of that would be, if we want to take into account the thou shalt not kill, well, consider a situation in which someone is coming at you and they are about to murder you. In that situation, that's a little bit of a contradiction, right? So you'd be stuck. You'd be like, well, what do I do? Do I just allow this person to murder me so that I can, adhere to the principle of thou shalt not kill because that's the universal maxim and I have to act that way? No, it would then be, in any given situation, become a new maxim. So in any given situation in which someone's trying to murder you and violating the universal maxim of you should not kill, well then you are then justified to kill them in the preservation of yourself. So, makes sense. But the problem with the categorical imperative rests within the fact of its similarity to the definition of a pure strategy in game theoretic strategies. So as we recall, the definition of a pure strategy is to act in such a way or by such a principle such that in identical situations acting by that principle would lead to the same result. And then the categorical imperative is that act in such a way or by such a maxim that acting in accordance with that maxim in identical situations could be turned into a universal principle which is ethical and justified unless it leads to logical inconsistencies. So, to put that into context, the problem with that is that it puts you in an either-or situation. You have to pick a specific principle. So in terms of the prisoner's dilemma, it would put you in the context of you'd either have to will as a universal maxim either competition or cooperation in such circumstances. So it's kind of twofold because in some sense that could be how you solve the prisoner's dilemma if you approached it from that perspective. But it's not in fact how you actually solve it. So what I mean is, if we were to apply a pure strategy categorical imperative to the prisoner's dilemma, let's say that we wanted to will to solve the problem. We want to will it that competition in such a situation is the appropriate ethical maxim to achieve the best result. So in that case, we would get the result that we got in session 3.5, which would be that the person would confess with the hope that they would put the other person in prison and they'd walk away free. So that is how we solved it, but those aren't the reasons, that's not the reasoning through which we got to our conclusion to choose that option. The method we used to solve the prisoner's dilemma was a mixed strategy, right? Because what you have to do to solve that problem, or what we did to solve that problem, was to calculate the probabilities of what would happen not just to me and not just to the other person, but what would happen to me relative, like based on my choice relative to the choices of the other person. We calculate the probabilities of behavior, and then we determine that this would be the best option to confess, because if we confess, then best case, we walk away free. Worst case, we go to jail, which I argued, is kind of justified anyway because you committed a crime. But the point there is that that's a mixed strategy. That's not a pure strategy. And you can only say that that was a pure strategy and led to success by being a pure strategy if you approached it with only the reasoning that you are willing competition as a universal maxim. So it wouldn't include any of the considerations of probability. So, and then this also has the added dimension of whether you could in fact will competition as a universal ethical maxim in such situations, and that would be also contingent on whether it would be beneficial. So the point of a universal maxim is, I would say, more aimed towards an optimal strategy, in the sense that a universal maxim isn't just something that is ethical for yourself, but it's a principle of ethics which applies to everyone, to what's ethical for both of us in a situation. So in that sense, the true goal of the categorical imperative is to be a optimal mixed strategy when it is in fact a pure strategy, and I think in that sense it negates itself. So let's consider this in a version of an iterated prisoner's dilemma. So allow me to explain an iterated prisoner dilemma. So a version of that would be, consider yourself a business owner of let's say gas station. You own a gas station directly across the street from another gas station, and you only have the opportunity to change your prices once a month by a certain time, like a certain day and a certain time of day. So let's say that you're in debate about whether you're not getting enough business, so you're not sure whether you should, like how you should go about getting more profit. So it crosses your mind that you should essentially lower your prices perhaps, so that the business will inevitably come more to you. But the problem with that, of course, is that the business owner across the street could also change his prices. So that would mean that in terms of, since you can only change your prices once a month, and we assume that initially in the first circumstance you can't communicate. Let's say that you haven't had a chance to talk to that other business owner and you want to make that decision by, let's say, 12 a.m. So you got to make that choice. So the problem, though, is that if you raise your prices or lower them, let's say lower them, and then for the first month and the other person doesn't lower them, then for the first month of business, well then obviously you're going to get more business. But the business owner across the street would in turn the next month lower his prices too. And then what you would have done by lowering your prices is, yes, you would have achieved a greater profit for the first month, but then overall all you've done is contribute to the net loss of both of your businesses. So in that case, to lower your prices would be acting in accordance. It's the same kind of situation initially. That's the key there, initially, as the prisoner's dilemma. It's that you don't have enough time to communicate with the other person. You have to make a choice, but that choice is contingent or has an effect on both of you. So what you've done in that first instance is use, again, competition as a universal maxim. And what we've seen is that maxim does not yield an ethical result or a good or beneficial result for you or for the other person over time. So it negates itself. So even if you were to say in the first instance of the actual prisoner's dilemma that a pure strategy categorical imperative could be implied and could be successful, it would then be negated by iterated versions, as I've just described, of the prisoner's dilemma. But then if you wanted to say, for example, what if we chose cooperation, right? Because cooperation in an iterated version to use it, if you wanted to apply pure strategy, you'd have to choose cooperation given the circumstance. But then that would mean that you would also have to apply cooperation in the first circumstance, so in the initial prisoner's dilemma. So if you were to apply a cooperative principle or act in accordance with the pure strategy of cooperation, then what you would do would be to not confess. But we've already determined that in that situation that's not the correct principle to use, or that's not the correct choice, because if you don't confess, well then your risk is too great, because if that other person, who which you have no way of knowing what they're going to choose, if they confess and implicate you, then you're going to jail for 10 years. So it's not the right choice. So the pure strategy, the categorical imperative, sort of self-defeats, cancels itself out. And then if we were to look at this again in terms of, for example, the Hofstadter offer, the $1 million game, if we were to employ, I should say, a pure strategy, the categorical imperative, it would again put us in an either-or situation of cooperate or compete. So in this situation, cooperate would more so be to play, and, compete would be to play, and cooperate would be not to play. So that is to say, if we choose to compete, well then, in that circumstance, no one stands to win anything, right? Because if we all compete, then the amount of the prize reduces proportional to the amount of people who enter the game, or inversely proportional. And then, counter to that, if we choose to cooperate in the sense that we all decide, well, the risk is too great, like there's no guarantee that anyone will win, so therefore none of us will play. Well, then that leads, as we recall, to the negative fact that, well then, Scientific American and Hofstadter just laugh in the face of everyone, like, you can't solve the game. So the problem there, like I said, is that the pure strategy fails and the categorical imperative fails, because you can't will either of those things and yield an ethical or desirable beneficial result. Again, what you want is an optimal mixed strategy, or a mixed strategy at large, which we determined was to calculate in some sense the probability of how to determine that. So we determined that one of the best ways to solve that problem would be to have, for example, a dice, an automated dice of 100,000 or less sides, such that the people who roll one specific side will be the person to enter the game, whether that's one or two people or a couple people. The amount of people is, no matter what, severely reduced by virtue of rolling a dice, and only those who roll a specific number of the die enter the game. So again, it fails. Alright, so with that being said, it stands to reason that in most given circumstances, and here's coming a fun catch, we see how the best possible option is typically a mixed strategy, or depending on the circumstance, an optimal mixed strategy. And the reason that's kind of interesting that I say that is that, notice how I said there, in any given circumstance. So in that kind of way there, by virtue of saying that, in a sense, you could make or say that a mixed strategy or a mixed optimal strategy could be conceived of as also a variety of a pure strategy, or that a pure strategy, how do I put it? Like, in the sense that a pure strategy is about following a certain principle, right? So you could say that that certain principle, applied in any given or identical circumstances, is the principle of following a mixed strategy, which is to say that you calculate the probability of different things. So I think in that way, both the categorical imperative and the pure strategy can be redeemed, but only by way of turning them into the mixed strategy. So it's not really that. It's just sneaky. Like, it's doing something, but it's not really doing anything. It's just one of those things. So with that being said, let's look at a different strategy by virtue of a different game, or perhaps the same strategy, a mixed strategy, through a different game. So you may be familiar with the game Chicken. As you might know it, as I did know it, it's the game in which you run across the street and try not to get hit by a car. Or whoever won't do it is the chicken. I don't know. In any case, that's not the game that Marrow is talking about. So the game of Chicken that Marrow is talking about in his book it was a game that was first presented in the 1955, I believe, James Dean movie Rebel Without a Cause, in which teenagers drive cars towards a cliff, and the first one to jump out of the car is the chicken. And this can also, like, in a different version of this, is that kids drive cars on a narrow road towards each other, and the first one to swerve out of the way is the chicken. So the objective of the game, I mean, the game is in itself irrational, but nonetheless it has its own logic and rationality within the context of its, own irrational game. So the objective is, of course, not to die, but also not to be the chicken. So the game is itself stupid, of course. Like, it's an absurd game. Like, there's no benefit to playing this game. But, as of course, with Game Theory, what's interesting about it is when you sort of deconstruct that in just sort of the bare principles, or the bare sort of, like, maybe phenomenological principles of the structure of the game itself, and how that applies and the ways that we see it in actual reality. So to sort of strip it down, the dimension of the game, or to remove it from its actuality and make it more abstract, is that you're in a situation with another person in which you're both imminently headed towards a disastrous circumstance, and the only way that you two are willing to avoid that disastrous circumstance is if one of you jumps out first, or rather you're racing towards this disastrous circumstance together, but neither of you wants to get out until the other one gets out first, so in order that, you have the glory of being the braver one and the other person is the weaker one. So the kind of strategy implicit in there is that the way to win, or the ideal way to win, is to try to convince the other person that you are not going to back out, right? That you're willing to take it all the way to the death, and that they in turn need to be frightened by your, like, perhaps austerity is the right word, your willingness to, stay firm in what you are and what your objective is, and not, change your position. So some applications that Merrill points out to real world, or the way that we see this kind of game playing out between people or between countries, would be during the Kennedy administration, in which Kennedy's advisors, relative to the tense situation with Russia at the time, during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was Kennedy was advised by a game theorist, game strategist, and game theory has been around in politics as well for quite some time, particularly during that time, and basically they were playing a game of chicken. The objective was to convince Russia, and I think it was Khrushchev, something like that, one of the states people of Russia. The objective was to convince them that they were willing to go as far as war. That they were willing to go as far, that the U.S. was willing to take it as far as dropping, a nuclear device on them, such that they would back out. And in effect, the strategy worked. So that's really interesting. Another example that Miro gives of this sort of, he uses this as an example of the game of chicken, but it seems to me more like a sort of converse game of chicken, in the sense that he brings up the position of Britain in World War II, and how they were more or less quite reluctant to join the war effort, and not wanting to take it that far, that is, not wanting it to escalate to that point. So in the mind of the Prime Minister of Chamberlain at that time, he saw war as the worst possible result. So his sort of strategy was to wait as long as possible before joining in. Well, I guess there it is, right there, and there's the chicken. His strategy was to wait as long as possible to try and avoid going to that extent, to the loss of life, etc. And it was eventually Winston Churchill who convinced Britain to join the war effort. However, they did eventually do it, but not until the point at which they realized that, the situation is completely it's getting out of control, like Hitler needs to be taken down a notch, etc. So that's interesting too, and the reason I find that converse is that I guess in a sense they were collectively rushing towards a disastrous end, and namely Hitler and his doings were that disastrous end. And the strategy employed by Chamberlain was to try to avoid an even more disastrous end. So he deemed the more disastrous end getting involved, but then once it came to the point that, they're already implicitly involved and that Hitler's probably the worse than war, they were eventually persuaded to actually join in the game and deem themselves. So it's converse in the sense that they're kind of playing chicken prior. It's as if they were too squeamish to even get into the car, but then it came to the point where they got into the car. Or even you could, I'm not sure if you could apply that the other way around and say they were already in the car and joining the war was getting out of the car. I don't know, but you'd really have to reason through that to figure that out. If you've got an answer to that, or if you've got a different conceptualization of the game of chicken relative to Britain and Germany during the Second World War, please give your analysis below. I would appreciate it, because my mind is just not quite there right now. But to bring in another dimension of this, so this is kind of like an asymmetric game, or what's called an asymmetric game in game theory. So an asymmetric game is a game in which the players, there could be 2 or more players, let's say 3 players, in which they're either in the same situation and have different priorities, or they're in different kinds of situations. So the example that Marrow gives of this is of the King Solomon. I believe that he was the king of Israel at one point. I know that he died in like 930 BC, before the Common Era, so we're long ago, like 3,000 years ago. But so King Solomon found himself in a situation that he was meant to resolve. He was the dictator of the situation. So basically what he had was, there was a child and there were 2 women, supposedly, like this is like I think a biblical story, 2 women who claimed that this child was theirs. It was a small infant, and they both were saying it was theirs, and it was up to him to decide who the child belonged to. And so his strategy, supposedly, in this game was to say that he would cut the child in half so as to be fair, so that each mother, would have half an infant. And immediately, one of the women instantly objected. She was like, no. And that's who he gave the child to. So the strategy there, or the implicit strategy there, is that how he conceptualized the problem, or how he's believed in game theoretic terms to conceptualize the problem and his strategy to the problem, is that he perceived that one of these people obviously is lying, and to the liar, what's worse for them is for the other person to win, because that's their ultimate objective, really, is to hurt that other person or to win over that other person somehow. So he speculated on that account that if he were to posit somehow something irrational, such as hurting the child, that the real mother would speak up and the false one would be quiet, because it's like kind of, it's not quite as paramount to her whether the child lives or dies. What's important to her is that she, beats this other person at the game that they're playing. So that's really interesting. That's a demonstration of an asymmetric game. And the point of that, and also just the game of chicken at large, and also relative to game theory at large, is this sort of notion that becomes apparent, which is that sometimes the most rational choice is to act irrationally. So there, right? So put that into context is that if you want to say that the game played by King Solomon and the 2 women was a rational game, his strategy was irrational in the sense that it's obviously absurd to cut a child in half, but nonetheless it yielded a rational result, or it led to the proper consequence. And similarly, I think you could apply that to the situation relative to Cuba, Russia, and the United States and the Kennedy administration, because obviously it's not rational to wage nuclear war. However, in a situation where your hands are tied and you feel that you need to intimidate someone into doing something, that irrationality, if what you're trying to intimidate them against doing is worthy, like if it's justified, if what they're doing is so terrible, it's arguable that it justifies the means of the sort of demonstration of the willingness to take it as far as something as irrational as nuclear war. So in that sense, you could argue that the most rational option for the United States at that time was to intimidate those other two parties to the point where they were willing to play chicken and back out, because they weren't willing to risk that loss. And really, I think in itself, the dollar auction, we refer back to that, it's kind of a game of chicken in its own weird way too, right? Because you're both sort of, in the game of the dollar auction, you're both sort of racing towards an irrational consequence of your actions, right? You're both sort of headed towards a relatively disastrous end, which is namely the auction exceeding $1. But you're both still going towards it, and it becomes a question of who's going to back out first in order to avoid going over top of the dollar, and sort of implies or necessitates some degree of strategy or intimidation in order to get the other person to back out. But it's a matter of how, in that context, would you do that? Isn't it just completely random, completely arbitrary, based on one's own fear alone of how far it would go? But yes, it's interesting to think about. So I think I'm gonna leave this at that. Lots of things to think about. Lots of things indeed. If you have any questions or comments or analysis to do of your own, please be obliged to leave it below, and also subscribe to keep updated with the channel, of course, if you're not already. And I had previously said that I would be uploading on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and as you might notice, it's Tuesday actually, but I missed Saturday. So I'm going to be, from this point forward, only producing one game theory video a week, unless I have, for some reason, an extra amount of time during the week, because it is quite a bit of labor, you know, like on top of all my other intellectual work to do, and I'd also like to produce like other content as well, not just like, you know, always game theory, although like it's lovely and I could do it all the time, but it's a rabbit hole, you know. So one video for now a week until, you know, I can get settled and going. So yes, so goodbye, thanks for being here.